Well, there's been a lot of back and forth on these language directives regarding our healthcare system. That 31-page directive, of course, the French language minister, Jean-François Roberge, has emphatically said care in English in healthcare will not change. But of course, when you look at those directives, certainly says things about English eligibility certificates to access care. It has led to many questions. One of those Montrealers asking questions is none other than Gary Bernstein. Joins us on the line now. He's a 77-year-old Montrealer, and he decided to do something about the questions over English eligibility certificates. Gary, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I imagine you were quite concerned when you heard this back and forth over this language directive. Take me back to that. When you started to hear that things might be changing on the healthcare side of things when it comes to healthcare in English, what were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking two things. First of all, that it would be really tragic if the situation occurred where language got in the way of getting proper medical care. Most of the interactions I've had with the healthcare system have been in English because I go to the Jewish General or the MUHC hospitals. But I've had a couple of occasions where a healthcare professional would refuse to speak to me in English, and my French is good enough to get by, but I was never really certain whether I was transmitting the right information to them. Mm-hmm. So, just from the perspective of getting good health care, this was worrisome. But more worrisome to me, or equally worrisome, was the demotion of English-speaking people into second-class citizens who had to be identified by a symbol. That symbol being this certificate that is impossible to get. And I'm particularly sensitive to that because I'm Jewish, as you know from the name Bernstein. And, from most people who are familiar with history know what happened in Nazi Germany between 1933 and 39, where Jews had to wear these, yellow stars to identify themselves. And if they didn't wear them, they were shot on the spot. So I'm sensitive to anything that singles out. It doesn't really matter whether you're Jewish, Irish, Catholic, Asian. Anything that separates us visibly from the rest of the population is really troublesome and worrisome.
So, Gary, and listen, I understand that. I just want to know from your perspective because, Jean-François Roberge, the health minister Christian Dubé, Eric Girard, who is responsible for relations with English language ministers, on the record, whether it's their open letter or if they have done media interviews, they're emphatic, right, that it won't change. Now, of course, we can look at that directive written by some bureaucrat and say, it doesn't look like it. But has that not assuaged your fears at all when the politicians here have tried to alleviate those concerns? When you've heard those politicians talk and read their words, what are you thinking then?
Well, I was thinking precisely what's happened in other situations. For example, the McGill tuition cutback. Which was first announced one way, and they said, we'll meet with you, and then, they made it worse, basically. Everybody's familiar with that. I don't trust what people say unless it's written down. Mm-hmm. And in my view, the damage has already been done. It's kind of like the headline that says, dog murders woman, and there's retracted the next day. Nobody bothers to think about the retraction. That's what sticks in their mind. And my worry is that in the healthcare system, there will be enough healthcare workers who will see the three ministers or the original directives as being the ones to be followed, and not really pay much attention to the idle words of the three ministers.
Well, and I think right. I think you are onto something on how this will play out in the real world, particularly with some people that may not be keen on providing services in English. So, Gary, why don't you tell us? With those concerns in mind, with the all this notion of having to have an English eligibility certificate to access healthcare in English, you did something exceptional, which is you tried to get one at age 77. Tell our listeners about your attempt at that.
There was an article published in the Gazette. I forget if it was in the minister's rebuttal or a separate article that gave a link to an email address to write to get the certificates. And, I suspected that if I wrote, I wouldn't get an answer. I did get an answer. And the answer was basically, well, you're too old, go to school in Quebec. So, we don't provide these certificates. And, the writing was on the wall because, of course, I knew that, what does the education system have to do with the healthcare system in terms of, solidifying my position within the healthcare system. So, apart from, my objection to having to have a certificate, I just thought it was one of these situations where, the government has published information that's completely nonsensical. And in fact, this has happened in many, many other cases where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Yeah, we're with Gary Bernstein. He's a 77-year-old Montrealer, recently tried to get an English eligibility certificate to the government. Gary, if one of those digits was gone, if you were 7 years old, it probably would have worked out, but not at 77.
That's right.
So faced with that the government won't give you a certificate, you're doing something a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I would say. You've been printing up some stickers, your own eligibility certificate. Tell our listeners what you've been doing since you can't get a certificate from the government.
Yeah. Well, it arose out of my frustration that everybody talks about, how terrible things are, but nobody does anything. So I decided in my small way that I would try to get some media attention by printing up these stickers. And in fact, I stood in front of the Jewish General Hospital yesterday, handed them out. People were very, very receptive. And since that article was published in the Gazette, my phone has not stopped pinging. People want more certificates, One woman said, "Can I have a lot of them and distribute them in my condo?"
Yeah.
So it was more of an attempt to capture a wider audience than just our own echo chamber. Mm-hmm. And I've sent several of the articles on the topic to the New York Times, to their tip lines, and so far I haven't whetted their appetite, but I'm hoping, if enough of these things get around, that maybe they will promote it in their Canadian New York Times newsletter.
Well, it certainly has happened in the past where a way to get the Quebec government to come back to reality is public shaming internationally. So I don't think that's a bad idea. Now, Gary, with these stickers, right? And I'm looking at the stickers that you printed out. They say, je suis an historic Anglo, protect our healthcare language rights. You got a Canadian flag and a Quebec flag. Any thoughts based on the initial reaction here? Do you think maybe you can turn this into some sort of fundraising campaign? Charge $5 a sticker, give the money to a good healthcare cause, something to that end?
Well, yeah, it's really a two-part question because somebody wrote to me. The response has been tremendous. Somebody wrote to me this morning and said, "Could I make buttons and sell the buttons?" So I'm thinking of asking Aaron Rand, who has a website where he sells his T-shirts.
It's the historic Anglo every Christmas time, right?
Yeah, well, it's still there. You can still buy them. So yeah, I was thinking of that. The other part about it is I originally had my granddaughter, who is 9 years old, perfectly bilingual, make up a sign saying any donations will be forwarded to the Quebec Community Network Group.
Oh, yes. Yeah. QCGN.
Yeah. And then I decided at the last minute not to do that, not to solicit money, because as I saw when I handed out the stickers, people were suspicious enough that some of them didn't want to take, So yeah. I'm going to do another one. I'm probably going to go to the MUHC next week, and I'm going to leave the money part out for the time being. But if it gains enough traction, then I'll try to do it through social media. Gary,
a fun story, fun way at trying to get some action here on a serious matter. Do appreciate your time and for being a loyal listener of CJAD as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That's Gary Bernstein right there, 77-year-old Montrealer. Didn't get his eligibility certificate, but has got a whole lot more attention because of it.